Hello, today is Sunday, November 8th, 2020. As you can see, the pandemic continues. We're still not able to worship in our chapel at the Park Place Retirement Community. So we'll continue to do our lessons where they can be shown online on YouTube. The pandemic continues. The numbers we've had this past week have been really bad. Over 100,000 cases a day in the United States. And Tennessee, for example, just yesterday, had over 5,000 new cases, which is the most that Tennessee has had at any point in this time. So with the pandemic continuing, we need to continue to practice those things we've been taught with social distancing, wearing masks, doing all those things, washing our hands, doing those things to keep ourselves safe, avoid large crowds. So we've been fortunate here in the Park Place community to not have been touched by this too much, and we just hope that continues, hope and pray that that continues. Also in the past week, we've had a presidential election. Votes have been counted all week. Votes are still being counted. But yesterday it was projected that Joe Biden would be the new president of the United States. So he is the president-elect. There's still votes being counted. There's still certain challenges being made. But at this point, at least, Joe Biden is the president-elect. And we need to be praying for President Trump and also for President-elect Joe Biden. Today we're going to talk about a topic that touches all of us from one time to another, and that's the topic of jealousy. We've all at one time or another been guilty of being jealous of someone or something. We'll see someone, maybe we're jealous of a brother or a sister or a coworker. We'll see someone that has something or is in a better situation than we are or whatever it may be, and we may tend to have some jealousy there. You know, jealousy is referred to as a green-eyed monster. Because jealousy can become a monster. It can come to take hold of us and somewhat control us. And we need to work on that. I suspect that even here in the Park Place community, there are times when some of us are more jealous or jealous of something someone else has or a situation someone else is in. And that's a normal reaction. It's a normal human feeling to be jealous from time to time. It's just that we cannot let our feeling of jealousy lead us into sin, lead us into bad actions towards someone. Our story today is about Joseph and jealousy. But to set the stage for the story of Joseph, we have to go back in time to the story of his father, Jacob. If you'll recall, Jacob and Esau were born as twins, and that Esau was born first. These were twins born to Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac had gone over to the home country to get a wife. He got Rebekah as a wife, came back, and had these twins, Jacob and Esau. You'll recall the story about how even though Esau was born first, that Jacob tricked his father and took the birthright that was rightly due to his brother Esau, took his birthright and also his blessing. We recall the hatred and anger that caused from Esau toward Jacob. And as a result of that, Jacob was sent off to a far country, back to the home country, if you will, where Rebekah had come from, to her brother Laban. She said, now you go over to my brother Laban's place and you stay there for a while and maybe things will cool down here and Esau will not be so eager in killing you and maybe someday you can come back home. But for right now, you need to stay out of his way. So you recall the story. He goes to Haran, where Laban lived, and he finds Rachel there, beautiful woman. He wants to marry Rachel. So he asks his uncle Laban, can I marry Rachel? And he says, well, you can if you'll work for me for 7 years. So Jacob worked those 7 years. The time went by pretty fast because he had a goal in mind. He was going to be able to marry Rachel. And you know the story. The big day comes for the wedding and the bride wears a veil where Jacob cannot see her. And he does not realize until the next morning that he has married Rachel's sister Leah, Rachel's older sister Leah, instead of Rachel. So he's outraged. He goes to his father-in-law Laban and says, why did you do this to me? And he said, well, it's just not right for the older sister to be the one not married while the younger sister's married. He said, so Leah needed to be married first. Now, Leah wasn't great looking. Rachel was. But think about this. He got tricked. Jacob got tricked into marrying Leah instead of Rachel. Remember how he tricked his father to take his brother Esau's birthright? It's called sowing and reaping. He sowed deception and he benefited from it, but he later paid a price. So he goes to Laban and says, what can I do to marry Rachel? And he says, well, if you work 7 more years, you can marry Rachel. And the way the story goes, he did work the 7 more years, and he ultimately did marry Rachel. And after they were married, there became a problem because Leah was having children and had had children, and Rachel couldn't have any children. So the story we're told in Genesis 30 goes as follows. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister Leah and said to Jacob, give me children or else I die. And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? So she said, here's my handmaid Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I may have children by her. So she gave him Bilhah, her maid, his wife, and Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived and bore a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged my case, and he's heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again, and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. She's talking about wrestling with her sister. She was so jealous of her sister, Leah, that she decided to take matters into her own hands, and instead of letting God bless her when the time came to children, that she would send in her handmaid, Bilhah, to Jacob. Does that sound familiar? Do you remember the story of Sarah and Abraham? How Sarah didn't allow God to do what God does and honor his promise to them. So she sent in her handmaid Hagar. And as you recall, Hagar had a child named Ishmael. And then, of course, later when Isaac was born, Sarah was very upset with Hagar and Ishmael, and they were banished, basically. They were kicked out of the house. But if you'll recall, God promised Hagar that through Ishmael also there would be great nations. There would be 12 princes. And it's through Ishmael that we have the religion today of Islam, because it traces back to Ishmael and to Ishmael's father Abraham, just as Judaism and Christianity trace back to Isaac's father Abraham. And you recall the story. Once again, people not letting God take care of things, but taking them into their own hands. So at this time, Rachel was basically the wife living with Jacob. And so Leah was upset. And Leah says, I wish you'd let me be with him for a while. So she makes a deal with her, and she gives her some mandrakes. She bargained these mandrakes so that she could go in and be with Jacob some more. And here's what happened. In chapter 30, verse 20, Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I've borne him 6 sons. She went back into Jacob and had another son, making 6. She called his name Zebulun, and afterwards she still spent some more time with Jacob because she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then we're told, but God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So here we are. Rachel finally has a child. His name is Joseph. The way the story goes, Jacob ultimately goes to Laban and says, I've worked for you all these many long years. I want to go home. I want to go home. I want my family to go home with me. So he wanted Rachel and Joseph and all the other children to go home, back to the land where his parents lived, Isaac and Rebekah. Ultimately, Laban allowed them to go. They go back to the homeland, to their homeland where Isaac and Rebekah lived. And on the way, of course, Jacob's concerned that Esau might still be mad at him. So he's afraid there's going to be a battle with his brother Esau. So he gets all sorts of gifts for Esau. He puts them up at the front of the line. Then he puts the family members in order of importance to him. So the next to last was Leah and her children, and then the very last was Rachel and her son Joseph. And you'll recall the story that even though there had been all this jealousy between these twin brothers, that Esau comes out and meets him and embraces him and forgives him. And then here he is with his brother, and he's been forgiven, and all things seem to be well. And on the way back, Rachel actually had another child named Benjamin. And during the birth of Benjamin, Rachel was deceased. She died, and they buried her there along the way. So ultimately, they get back home. They get to meet, the children get to meet their grandparents, Isaac and Rebekah. And things go along pretty well there for a while, but then there's a problem. Jacob loved Joseph more than he loved his other children. So let's go to the text here. And this is in Genesis chapter 37. Joseph, it says, now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report to them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. He had made him a tunic of many colors, or a coat of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So Joseph had a dream and told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. He said, please hear the dream which I've dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said, shall you, the younger, indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, look, I've dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So Jacob was upset about what the dream that Joseph revealed to him, but we're told that he kept the matter in mind. Now what happened next is the brothers are out tending the sheep, and Jacob decides he needs to get a report from them, so he sends Joseph out to meet them. And here's where the story picks up. Now when they saw him, the brothers, when they saw Joseph afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said one to another, look, this dreamer is coming. Come therefore, let us kill him and cast him into some pit. And we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what becomes of his dreams. But Reuben heard it, and he delivered Joseph out of their hands and said, let's not kill him. Shed no blood, but just cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness. And do not lay a hand on him. And Reuben intended to go back later to deliver Joseph and bring him back to his father. So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped him of his coat of many colors, and they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. And they sat down to a meal, but they looked up, and here came a company of Ishmaelites, coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brothers listened. And they pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. And you know what happened next? Reuben came back to save his little brother Joseph, and he's not there. He finds out that he's been sold into slavery to the Ishmaelites. Now remember, the Ishmaelites, the descendants of Ishmael, Isaac's brother. Ishmael, whose mother Hagar was cast out with Ishmael when he was a teenager. But these were Ishmaelites. They were people of his that were descendants of this same Ishmael. So Reuben sees that he's gone. They say, we've sold him. So they take this coat of many colors and they kill a goat, and they put the blood of that goat on this coat. And they take it to their father, and they say, this is what's left of Joseph. We don't know where he is or what's become of him. And when Jacob saw that, he recognized and said, this is my son Joseph's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son for many days. And all his daughters and sons arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Now the Ishmaelites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. So that's as far as our story today goes, when Joseph is sold into slavery and ends up in Egypt. And of course we know that ultimately the children of Israel went to Egypt where Joseph was. We're going to talk about that next week. And they stayed there 430 years before they came back to the land of Canaan. But the story is so important because of the various times we see jealousy here, and that being motivated by jealousy, people did bad things. People lied to each other. They deceived each other. But the story of Isaac and his son Jacob and his son Joseph is all a part of that plan that God has had for us. All a part of that plan. Now, the secular world is familiar with the story of Joseph and his coat. There was an Andrew Lloyd Webber play on Broadway for many years called Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And it's come out several times and been recast over the years. And it's a very popular play based on this life of Joseph. We got to be careful with jealousy. Jealousy can be very unhealthy. And we see here, jealousy led these brothers to sell their own brother into slavery. How horrible. But perhaps even more horrible, they deceived their father into thinking Joseph was dead when Joseph was really alive. And we'll take the story up there next week. Let's go to our Father in prayer. Dear God, we come before Thee now on this Sunday. We just praise Your name. We thank You so much for being our God. We thank You for the blessings we have. We thank You for the fact that we live in the country of America where we're just so incredibly blessed. We ask that You'll be with all of our elected officials in the coming days. Be with President Trump and be with President-elect Biden as they go through the activities that are required and as a part of a transition. And while we know votes are still being counted, dear Lord, we just ask that all people work together to follow our democratic principles, and that we'll have wisdom and discernment, and that the right result will ultimately be reached for our country. Please be with all of us and keep us safe from this pandemic, dear Lord. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Stay safe.